Hello, my friend. A very happy Thursday, January 23, 2025, to you and to yours. I pray that this finds you well from wherever and whenever you are tuning in. And I want to welcome you to part 2 of a 4-part series on servant leadership. And today we are talking about you as God's leader. You as God's leader. Yesterday, in part 1, we talked about God as being the ultimate leader, right? And if you think about it, God is the one who gets his leadership from no one. God has always been. He is eternal. He is self-existent. He is self-sustaining. He is the epitome of leadership. And so why is that important? That is important because when we understand that God is the ultimate leader, then you and I understand that any leadership that we ever have has been conferred upon us or delegated upon us or to us from the Lord, number one. And then number two, that God is the epitome and chief example of leadership. So if we are to excel in the leadership that has been delegated upon us, then we do well to get our cues from God. And so yesterday, we took a journey of seeing how God's leadership is exemplified in the story that he is telling. What is that story? Creation. God created a beautiful and a perfect world out of the essence of who he is. He had a vision and he brought that forth in creating everything that you and I now know. And then the second part of the story is redemption, when man rebelled against God and essentially severed the relationship between us and God. God did what leaders do. He didn't point fingers. He took responsibility and he paid the ultimate price in redemption to reconcile us back to him. And he put us on a path of restoration, restoring us to the original vision that he had, even as we look forward to the day when God will make everything right. Yeah. So even right there, you and I can get a cue of what our leadership should look like. Part of it is creating and bringing forth the vision that God has put in us and seeing those visions all the way to the end. And we're going to look at some of that today as we explore part 2 of you and I as God's leaders. So today we're going to talk about 2 main things. Number 1 is the spheres of leadership that God has given you and I, and then we will close it with talking about the essence of true leadership, or the essence of godly leadership, so to speak. So let's jump in and let's start looking at the spheres of leadership that God has given you and I. In way of introduction, allow me to say that everyone is a leader. So you may have heard of this quote that leaders are not born, leaders are made. So I agree with that quote, but I also disagree, and let me explain. Leaders are born. And I want to add that each one of us is born a leader. Why? We are created in God's image and God is a leader. So it follows that the apple does not fall far from the tree. You are created a leader. However, I do agree with the statement also that leaders are made. Why? Because the seed of leadership in you has to be developed if you are going to become the leader that God has already ordained you to be. I love this quote from Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich, where he says the oak tree lies in the acorn, right? If you take an acorn, inside that acorn is an oak tree, but that acorn has to develop into an oak tree. Inside you, the proverbial acorn of leadership is the seed of leadership, but you have to be made. Even though you were born with the seed of leadership, you have to be made and evolve and grow into a leader. Now, the other thing that I also want to say is that leadership is not about titles. That's how the earth defines leadership. Who are you? Tell me your title. Right? I am supervisor. I am worship leader. I am president. And that's how the world defines leadership. But true leadership is about influence. And to each of us who is a leader, God has given us a measure of influence. If you will, spheres of influence. And that's what I want to take you through in the next few minutes. Let's look at the spheres of influence that God has given you. Now, the greatest sphere of influence that you will ever have is over yourself, is over your own life, and over the outcomes that you generate out of your life. I'll say that again. Self-leadership is the highest form of leadership. You see, there is little else that you and I can control, but God has given us free will, volition to design, to direct, and yes, to lead our lives. Now, you and I know that we cannot choose our background. For example, you had no choice about where you were born, what family you came from, your race, your nationality, the environment that you found yourself in. By and large, we cannot choose a lot of the circumstances that happen around us, but there is one thing that we can always choose, is our response. Right? Your background, your environment, it's just a starting point. Where you were born is just a starting point. The circumstances around which you were born were just the starting point. They do not have to be the end point unless you settle, and you basically settle for it. God has given you free will to choose. To choose what? To choose your beliefs, to choose your thoughts, to choose your attitudes, and by so doing, to choose your actions and to choose your outcomes. Listen to a couple of quotes that were given by a couple of philosophers. This first one is by Albert Campus, and he said that man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is. Listen, every other creature, a lion is doing today what a lion did in Genesis 1 when it was created. It never evolves to become more than it is. We human beings, we have the capacity. Look at us today. We are very different from what we were in Genesis 1. We have the capacity to grow, to become more than where we were born, to become more than what we were born into. We have the capacity to evolve. Listen to this other quote by Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega. He says, human beings are born into a natural state of disorientation with our world. In other words, human beings are the only creatures that are not content with our environment. We seek to shape our environment. Animals, on the other hand, are simply led by instinct and they accept their world for what it is. You and I have been given the godlike power to create our own lives and to create our own world. That is why God did not create this keyboard in Genesis 1, because he gave you and I the ability to co-create with him, not just to create things and to influence our environment, but also to create and, if you will, design our own lives. But my friend, this starts by you and I becoming a leader and taking responsibility over your life. Listen, the easiest thing in life is to play victim and to blame everything and everyone else for your life. If the government was better, there are some who are rejoicing and going like, now that Trump is in power, I'm going to do better. There are some of you who are cursing and saying that now that Trump is in power, my life cannot be better. We blame everything. We blame the weather. We blame our families. We blame our spouses. But my friend, as long as you play victim, you relinquish your God-given ability and power to direct and to design your life. It's when you take responsibility and you say, my life is what it is, and it is within my power to direct and to change my life, that true transformation comes in our lives. You see, you and I have the tendency of holding everybody and everything else to a higher standard than we hold ourselves to. but it's when you take charge and authority of your life. And in the words of the poem Invictus by William Henley, you say, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. That you start taking charge and directing not just your life, but also directing your outcome. Because you see, self-leadership is not only the highest form of leadership, but allow me to say that it is the prerequisite even to be able to be an effective leader in any other sphere. Because at the end of the day, the only ultimate control that God has given you is over yourself. So that is sphere number 1. Let us look at sphere number 2. God has given you leadership straight out of the gate when you were born over your assignment. Do you realize that there is an assignment on your life? That you are created on purpose, filled with purpose, and for a purpose. Allow me to share with you Genesis 1 and verses 28. This is the first conversation that God had with the first man. Now, you would hopefully agree that the first conversation anybody has with anyone is probably an important one, if not the most important. This is what God first said to the first man. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply. Replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. I like what Myron Golden says. He says that what separates us from creation and creatures is that you and I have been given the godlike ability to create, to connect, and to contribute. Listen, there is an aspect of God's creativity and God's glory that has been deposited in you. And purpose, I like also this quote from Myron Golden, is when you learn to live in your creative space to make the world a better place. Purpose is living in your creative space to make the world a better place, tapping into the unique genius that is in you and that is you, so that you can, like God, create out of the vision that God has put in you to bring forth the things that God has put you on this earth to bring forth, and to take that vision all the way to the end, taking the example of God, who even when the vision was derailed by the rebellion of man, he took responsibility to redeem the situation and to restore the situation. You and I have been given seeds of greatness in us. There are things we are supposed to live on the earth, and upon our journey we are going to find roadblocks, but God has given us the authority to see that vision all the way to the end. Now, the things that God has put in us are not just for us, but they are for the service of others. I'm grateful for the guy who designed this keyboard. It is serving me and making my life easier. And so from the place of creativity, God has enabled us to create so that we can make a contribution that serves others. Allow me, as I wrap up on this sphere of the assignment that God has given you, to wrap up with a quote from Shirley Chisholm. And she said that service is the rent that we pay for the privilege of living on this earth. So number 1, God has given you leadership over the sphere of your life and the outcomes in your life. And then number 2, over the assignment that he has put over your life. And it behooves you to see that assignment, if you will, all the way to the end, to pay your due rent for living. And the last, I guess I got 2 more. The next sphere of influence is the lives of others. Now, you've probably heard it said that to each of us is given a measure of time, talent, and treasure. I like to add a 4th one. Each one of us is given a measure of ties. I just use the T word because it rhymes with time, talent, treasure. Ties. What do I mean by ties? Each one of us is given a measure of influence, relationships, people that we influence. And again, like I said, it's not about titles. Trust me, in life, we all have 3 groups of people. We have groups of people that we look up to and who influence us. We have peers, and we have mentees, whether it's a formal relationship or not, people that look up to us and whom we influence. Now, at the end of it, leadership comes down not to titles, but to moral authority, right? I think of somebody like Gandhi. Gandhi never had an official title, but yet he influenced billions of people around the world because he had the moral authority. Now, there are people, and maybe you can point out some people, whether it's in business or in the corporate world, at your workplace, maybe even in governments, that have the titles, but they lack the moral authority, right? Because leadership is not about titles. A title cannot make you a leader any more than the lack of a title takes away from the fact that you are a leader. It's all about moral authority, and God has given us people that we can influence. So again, the first sphere of influence is over your life and what you design your life to be and the outcomes of your life. Number 2 is over your assignment, your God-given purpose in the world. And number 3 is the sphere of influence of the people that God has put in your life to influence. Now, I want to add maybe an overarching sphere of influence, or the context in which you and I express leadership over our lives, over our assignment, and over the people that God has given us. And this is in the context of your world. God has put each one of us in the world to impact the world, but we impact the world from the corner of the world that we are in the context of our world. My world looks different than your world. And remember also that your world changes in times and seasons. When I grew up in Kenya, that was the environment I was in. That was my world. Now I'm in Kansas City, USA. This is a whole different world. Allow me to read you a verse that is found in Acts 17 and 26, talking about God. And it says that God, from one man, talking of Adam, depending on who your teacher is, from one man, God made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands, or the boundaries of their habitation. Point, you are where you are on purpose and for a purpose. Whatever season of your life you are in, whether it's in terms of geographical placement, whether it's in terms of the roles and responsibilities that are on your plate, whether it's in terms of the season of life you are in, that is your world and the context or sphere of influence upon which you are to exact your leadership. So in other words, take charge over your life, over the assignment that God has placed over you, and over the people that God has put in your path to influence right where you are. There is no time like now, and there is no place like here. And if you are to ever get to any other time and place and space, you can only get to it by acting and being faithful in the here and in the now. All right. So that's about the spheres of influence that God has given us. Now let's talk about the essence of leadership. As we conclude, let's land this plane, right? So the first essence of leadership is submission. Remember, you and I are not the ultimate leader, and we only have our authority to the extent that we are submitted to the chief authority. If a police officer from the Olathe Police Department stops me today, they are a human being like me. They are a man who puts their legs, their pants on one leg at a time. But as long as they are under the authority of the police department, then they have, if you will, civic authority over me in the jurisdiction of Olathe, right? So as long as they are submitted under the authority of the police department, then they have authority to operate in their capacity as police officer. Your boss at work, they have authority over you in the jurisdiction of work to the extent that they are submitted under whatever authority is above them. I am a worship leader in my church. I have been for many years. I have authority to execute in that position and over the people that I shepherd to the extent that I am submitted under the authority of my pastor. Right? The Roman centurion who met with Jesus understood this, and he said, when Jesus he asked Jesus to heal his servant who was sick. He says, I am a man under authority. I know how this works. So, the only way you have authority is by being submitted to the ultimate authority, that is God. And also, when you look and you learn your cues, your leadership cues from the ultimate authority. So that's number one as far as of leadership. Number two, and this is very, very sobering to you, is that you and I lead from the core of who we are. In other words, who you really, really are is what is leading people. Let me explain. You have heard of the saying that says, do not tell people to do not do as I say, do as I do. In other words, that as somebody said, your actions are speaking so loud I cannot hear your words. We are told this all the time, that children do not always hear what we say. They are looking at us and they are looking at our example. But let me tell you, what you do is not enough. Because out here in the open, I can put on a show. I can do all the right things. I can tick all the boxes. I can cross all the T's and dot all the I's. And from the argument of I'll be able to influence people from what I do, it would follow that that should work, right? But I have come to find, they say integrity is who you are when nobody is watching. And the funny thing is that who you are when nobody is watching is what leads people, even more than what you do. So yes, it is true that what you do influences people more than what you say, but who you are at the core is what ultimately influences people even more than what you do. You see, our energy does not lie. I think it was Jesus who said, a dirty well cannot bring forth clean water any more than an apple tree can bring forth orange tree. What we eventually birth in way of leadership and influence is who we are. Think, for example, about generational cycles. Yes, all families have one. What's that cycle that keeps repeating in your family? Good or bad, right? It might be a cycle maybe of disease. It might be a cycle of addiction. It might be a cycle of maybe, you name it. Listen to it. This is something that is passed on from generation to generation through bloodline. That tells me that influence, like in other words, your life and I is being affected by things that our ancestors did years ago. We don't even know them. We never saw them operate. But that essence of who they were in the core is carried through the bloodline. Point being, my friend, is that ultimately we lead people from the essence of who we are. And when we grow in our own integrity, when we grow internally in our capacity of who we really, really are, that translates out into the people that we influence. And this is an influence that ripples way beyond time and space. There are generations that will come after us that will be influenced, not so much by the things we said and did, but by the core of who we are. So you know what? At this point, if you are like me, you might be feeling a little inadequate to be a leader because I fall short in so many ways in terms of my submission to God. And I don't know about you, I have areas in my life that I'm not proud of. But I have good news for you and I have an encouragement for you. And this is the last bit in the essence of leadership, that leadership is a journey. Is a journey. And that God uses us to be leaders at whatever stage we are in the journey as we continue to evolve into who He has called us to be. I came here to encourage you that God uses imperfect people. Think about the world. The world is God's masterpiece, right? But yet He gave imperfect people dominion over the world. I think about Jesus, who came and he redeemed us and he died on the cross and he birthed the church. The church is Jesus' bride. It's his possession. It's his trophy. But do you know who he gave leadership of the church to when he left and he said, I'll come back one day? And he said, you take care of my bride. He left it in the hands of imperfect people. I think of myself as a human being. I am a worship leader at my church. God knows I am super imperfect, but God uses me. Forget the church where I lead. Forget the other areas in the community where I lead. The highest mandate that I ever have is to lead my own family, to lead my own children. The biggest influence that you will have over anyone is a life, and the biggest influence you will ever have over anyone is your children. And when I think of how imperfect a father I am, it's sobering and humbling that God, the ultimate Father, still chooses to use me as a steward of these lives that he has put in my hands. I think of David, a man who was so flawed, but yet he continued chasing after God, and God called him a man after his own heart. So yes, leadership is a journey. It's a journey of you and I continually submitting to God, continually looking to God for our cues, so that we can grow to become the leader that he has called us to be in our core. Because our core is the essence and the chief point from which we influence others. So, leader, God's leader, keep your head up. Remember that you were born a leader. You are created in his image. There is leadership of you. In what spheres, you ask? God has given you leadership over your own life and the ability to direct your outcomes, number one. God has given you leadership over the assignment, the special, unique purpose he has put you on this earth for. And God has given you leadership over the people that you are to influence. And that's in the context of the exact world, the exact corner of the world and space that God has put you. And continue submitting, continue on this journey of growing as the leader that God has called you to be by allowing God to change your core. And this happens as you continually submit under the leadership of the ultimate leader. Keep looking up, keep growing, keep reflecting him. So that's it for today. So I hope you join me tomorrow, and tomorrow we will look at the portrait of a leader. In other words, as God's leaders, God is the ultimate leader, and we as leaders to whom he has delegated authority, we wear many hats, and all of which are very important if we are going to show up effectively as the leaders, or in this case, as the servant leaders that God has called us to be. So that's tomorrow in part 3, Portraits of a God Leader. See you then, and have a great day. Bye-bye.